Friedrich Nietzsche on the Genealogy of Morals, Essay 1. So Friedrich Nietzsche is quite peculiar philosopher within the history of philosophy, probably one of the most prominent, most renowned philosophers. This is perhaps for a number of reasons. One of them is that he has a very powerful style. He's a very articulate writer, excellent writer of philosophical works, very literary. The second is that his work is very provocative. He develops very interesting new views about the nature and origin of morality, views that kind of articulate ideas that we saw earlier in Plato's Republic, espoused by Thrasymachus, and later in the second book by L15 and Adeimantus. At some level, you could say that Nietzsche is kind of developing upon the view of Thrasymachus that where justice and injustice are inverted, and justice is kind of like getting what you want. So what we're going to look at is his genealogy of morals, and it's within a set of polemical works that he writes. He writes a number of other works, and these are kind of his later works. There are works that are written before he actually goes insane. This is significant because his later works, which were not published at the time, were later published and in some ways misrepresented by his sister and her husband. And so there's questions about, really, in some cases, what Nietzsche wanted to say about in some of the later works. This is significant because, for example, Hitler and the Nazis would pick up on Nietzsche's works and say, well, this is very nice and can be perhaps used as a basis for Nazi ideology. You'll see why that's the case when we move along. And I think there's some basis in that. At the same time, you have to recognize that his work was also misinterpreted at some fundamental level. So let's move on. So within the first essay, Nietzsche begins by citing a fellow friend, in fact, Paul Rée, and his work, The Origin of the Moral Sensations. The work is about the concept of the good, and this is kind of what Nietzsche is going to be dealing with, and in particular, the origin of that concept. Now, Paul Rée says that the good is a name given to an action which is always useful to another, so it benefits the other in some way. So notice he's tying it to a kind of egoism that involves being related to an other in each case. Now what happens is that over time people forget this origin. And so again, this is Paul Rée's idea about the origin and evolution of this idea. So initially it's something that is a benefit to another, and later on this is forgotten and they see only the external form. And what's the external form? That you're doing something good for another. For example, could you go out and pick me up something at the store? And someone does that, and maybe it seems like they're doing it externally for some non-selfish altruistic reason, but in fact they might be doing it perhaps because it's useful and it has utility for them, and it also has utility for the person they're doing it for. But this is forgotten, and only the external form remains, and it's called good. And so what becomes good is this idea of a selfish action. This is kind of what we think today, for example, of what good is. It's something that's done without a selfish reason. But Paul Rée suggests, no, actually, the good is always that which is done for some useful reason, whether for myself and especially for another. So Nietzsche criticizes this. He notes that, look, Paul Rée's intention to seek an origin of the concept is good is right. But the problem is that he seeks for this origin in the wrong place. And Nietzsche claims instead that the good does not originate from those for whom good is done. Rather, and this is the key to Nietzsche's thought on this issue, good originates among those who call themselves and good, who claim to be good. In other words, I am good. And so who does this? And Nietzsche suggests, if you look in history, now Nietzsche was a philosopher, he was also a classicist who studied the ancient Greek philosophy and ancient Greek poetry and language and Latin too, and Roman literature. So he knows this origin very well. And he says, if you look at the classical literature, you see that the nobles, the lords and the aristocrats and the wealthy, they call themselves good, and in contrast, they distinguish themselves from and look upon the peasants and servile class as bad. So what Nietzsche is saying here is that good originates from this kind of aristocratic morality, that the king claims that I am good. And why is the king good? Because the king is good in and of himself, because he deserves to be king because of his heritage. And so there's a certain notion of bloodline and genealogical heritage attached to this concept of good. Notice that the book is called On the Genealogy, right, of morals. So genealogy and heritage then becomes the roots of what's good. Now what changes? Because over time, obviously, when we look at the notion of good, we don't think, well, what's good is a person who is a noble or aristocrat, right? What changes is that the aristocratic class declines and falls eventually, and the peasant class assumes power. We see this, for example, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, especially the French Revolution, become examples of this. They overturn the old power regimes, the monarchies and aristocracies. What happens then is that this aristocratic concept is itself overturned, inverted, and it's replaced by none other than the peasants, commoner class, of what should be good and evil, of what they deem to be good and evil, in contradistinction to what the aristocrats claimed to be good and evil, which was themselves, good and bad, which was themselves. So let's see how this takes place. And as you'll see, the entire work deals with understanding how this transition of power takes place and really what's motivating us when we look at the nature of good and bad. So what I have to introduce here is Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, which is central to his work. And here's an expression of it. Every animal instinctively strives for an optimum of favorable conditions under which it can expend all its strength and achieve its maximal feeling of power. Every animal abhors, just as instinctively and with a subtlety of discernment that is higher than all reason, every kind of intrusion or hindrance that obstructs or could obstruct its path to the optimum. Now, in understanding this, one has to look to the fact that Darwin and the concept of evolution is gaining ground during Nietzsche's time. And part of Darwin's concept is this idea that we're all sort of striving for life. So when Nietzsche looks at that, and he kind of accepts that, but he says, no, this is not correct. This is a minimal condition because, if you look at it, if we're all just striving for life, then the existence of an amoeba is, as much as nature would need to strive. So why construct these other beings, animals and humans and stuff? So part of the reason is that nature is not just striving for life. Nature is striving to flourish, to empower itself, to dominate, to become greater. And this becomes Nietzsche's concept of will to power, that it's not the will to life that's in nature, it's a will to striving for something higher and something greater, for self and a domination. This is the basic idea of Nietzsche. And so because of this, he'll tie, his concept can be tied to the ancient Greek concept, which we saw in Aristotle, of eudaimonia, which was translated before as that which is well destined and fortuned. And Nietzsche will interpret this to mean, well, this is what flourishing is, will to power. So we don't just seek to live, we seek to flourish. We seek the unobstructed expression of our vital instincts. We seek to outdo one another. This is in Greek called pleonexia. We seek to rule and to subdue others. And this is key. What furthers this? What helps us to do this? Because it's tied to eudaimonia, the happiness, right? Well destined, fortuned. What furthers this we call naturally. Now this is key. Naturally good. What suppresses it is naturally bad. So notice here the connection. Nietzsche is saying that this notion of flourishing is what we naturally desire. So what this means, and Nietzsche is suggesting this, that the aristocratic values are fundamentally the natural values from which the concept of good originate. Okay? So how does this evolve over time? And Nietzsche, again, he is a classicist, okay, so, and a philologist means a lover of words, philologist. So he's very adept at language, and he analyzes the German language, and he notices something very interesting. The word bad originally meant, which means schlecht, and it originally referred to that which is base or common, low, like the peasant. So slaves were called schlecht. So a slave in the house would be schlecht. Why? Because they're servile, weak, and sickly. In other words, and they're sickly because they're undernourished, they're not fed well. Alternatively, the master is called good or gut. Masters command are powerful and healthy, and they're well fed. And interestingly, if we look at the ancient heroes, for example, the Homeric heroes, Odysseus and Achilles and Hercules, we see that they were good in this sense, that they were powerful and healthy and commanding. But over time, this evolves and even spiritualizes, and the distinction between good, in other words, the powerful, and bad, common or low, becomes a distinction between good in some other sense and evil in a spiritual sense. Okay, so what happens is that these notions are transformed from just good and bad to good and evil. Okay, and we'll see how this happens. So part of this is this concept of ressentiment that Nietzsche develops. So we seek to flourish. This becomes a principle of Nietzsche's thought, and this includes, now notice, it's not just the master who is the powerful one who seeks to flourish, but the slave seeks to flourish too. The difference is that the slave can't, because the slave who is weak is bound to a master who is strong. So the slave hates the master because of this, but also loves the master. The slave hates the master because the slave has to obey and is subdued by the will of the master. So the slave cannot flourish because the slave must simply help the master to flourish. At the same time, the slave loves, and the love here is, what kind of love is it? Well, we're going to say, loves the master because the slave wants to be a master. The slave wants to dominate. Why? Because this is what we all seek. We all want to flourish, and flourishing means domination. So the slave develops, as a result of this dialectic, this exchange, ressentiment, which is just the notion of resentment tied to a moral aspect toward his master or her master. So it's a form of moral envy as such. So one is envious and resents what one desires and wants. So we see the slave wants to be a master and therefore resents the master and hates the master, but also loves the master because the slave wants to be a master. This leads to a peculiar result. The slave can't be a master, but wants to be a master. So how can the slave who wants to be a master obtain power do this, being weak? Resentment, and this is how it happened, leads the slave to deny those values that the master affirms. The slave, in turn, reevaluates. This is a kind of subconscious, psychological thing. It's not something necessarily conscientious. Reevaluates the rank order, the order established between master and slave. And so the slave says, what's good are the values of the slave. What's bad are the values of the master. The virtues of the master, then, magnanimity, pride, dominance, mercilessness, become bad. The virtues of the slave, service, chastity, obedience, humility, these become good. So a particular expression of this is the priestly caste. In other words, those who spiritualize these notions. The priestly caste, in particular, spiritualizes the morality that is espoused by the servant or slave. So what is good, again, is what is spiritually good now, the righteous. What is bad is spiritually bad, the evil and the damned. So what you want to see here is this slow change in these notions. Good was first the noble aristocratic virtues. Bad was the plebeian peasant servile virtues. But now it's transformed. Good is becomes something spiritual, the good of the righteous. Bad becomes something spiritually bad. And what would be spiritually bad in this inversion? It would be precisely the aristocratic values. So the aristocrats are deemed evil, the damned. And so they call the slave virtues good. And what are these virtues again? Notice this, and notice the tie to Christianity, because this is what Nietzsche wants to tie it to. And say, fundamentally, Christianity is a morality of slaves. This is what he's saying. It's a very, as I said, provocative view and contentious. So the virtues of the slave are service, meekness, humility, mercy. Why? Because the slave has to obey the master, and the slave has to be meek and humble to the master and has to serve the master. But then these become spiritualized as virtues. Austerity and fasting, also spiritual virtues. Why? Because the slave is deprived of food, so these become spiritualized. Again, purity and chastity. Why? Because the slave is not fed well, has low sexual desire, and there's also the concept of the eunuch, one who is deprived of sexuality, who is a slave. Okay, so notice how that these particular interesting expressions of the state, the class of slavery, become now spiritualized into virtues that are then claimed to be good. And this is Nietzsche's basic point. So in contrast, the virtues of the master become not just bad, right? But evil. So, and what are these virtues? Pride. So proud, the master is proud of him or herself. Magnanimity means broad-spirited, great in spirit. Why? Because they can conquer worlds, etc. Mercilessness. Why? Because to the master, to the proud, to these warrior spirits, it's never right to give mercy, and one would never ask for mercy. And dominion, of course, this spirit that conquers others. So the change here, and this is key for Nietzsche, this change, this inversion, inevitably it poisons the noble spirit, the noble morality. It degrades it, and degrades the valuations of the aristocrat. It seeps into the bloodstream. And here he means it's a historical seeping into the bloodstream. It's slowly eroding our natural expressions of morality, and it begins to invert it and make it sickly. Why? Because the slave morality becomes kind of the dominant form of morality that takes over in Western civilization, especially with the rise of Christianity and Christian values, which basically espouse those very slave values which Nietzsche is identifying.